Hey everybody. So today we're going to be talking about line work. This is a chapter continuing from Tattoo Techniques 101 that we just shared. And I will be releasing a PDF called Tattoo Techniques 101 as well. So you can get familiar with that. Now, as we spoke, this is still 101s. We're going through the absolute basics because it's so necessary to establish a very strong foundation before we move forward, right? As we're dealing with the introduction to tattoo techniques, we're just going to go through an overview of the very fundamentals that build up the tattoos and the techniques that we're going to be using. It will be very hard to develop if we're not mastering the basics, because then we're going to be having so many question marks moving forward. We're going to face some troubles, but we don't know why. Because in tattooing also, it's very simple and very straightforward, but there's so many different variables. And if one of these variables is off, then the entire artwork or technique is not going to work. And easily you're going to start second guessing every single move that you're making, even if it would just be one single thing you need to correct and everything else is correct. So you might start changing your machines, you might start changing your needles, you might start changing everything. But in the end, perhaps all these things were already correct, but you just missed on something like how you stretch the skin. And that's why the outcome actually wasn't what you wanted. But now you go and change all the other things and you end up in an even deeper mess. So when we understand the basics very strong, it will be so much easier to introduce new things here and there because we're standing on such a solid foundation. So I'm going to be introducing some tools that can be used for line work and some basic concepts of how the line work is supposed to be done. Now, nothing is set in stone. We can do things differently, but I'm trying to teach you the basic fundamentals that are recommended overall in creating line work. So yeah, that's the topic today, line work. Woohoo! Finally we're getting into tattooing, but still it's just the tip of the iceberg. So stay patient, please. To introduce two different types of line work. So on the left hand side we have some very inconsistent lines, and if we look at these areas here, these are not fully saturated, as you see. So what has happened here is, I would say it's probably one of two things. It could be numerous other things, but it's probably one of the two next things. So one is that the needle is not carrying enough ink on it, or the second one is that it's just not fully saturated because the artist did not go to the right skin layer. This type of pattern could also result from having a too fast hand speed compared to the machine, and thus just leaving less ink in the skin. And if we look at this area here, this seems like slight blowout. So possibly the needle is hitting too deep, but I would think that what has really happened here is that the artist's hand has moved much slower, thus depositing a lot more ink in this area, and this could cause this kind of spread. Overall, we don't see any tapering in these lines. They're pretty even, so I'm assuming these lines have been done with the shader, something like a 7 or 9 shader. Now these line works, you see, they're crisp, they're even thickness throughout, but as we already spoke, we can also make lines that are of different line weight. But again, here's a good example of what lines should be, and credit goes to Karmeli Sormus, or at Psyhiskont on Instagram. This is on a project that we work together with her and my wife Kathleen on. So this is exceptional line work, and I've seen it healed. It's very solid, perfect, exactly the way it's supposed to be. Now I'm going to try to find some other examples from the internet as well, so just give me a second. Okay, so here you see a good example of some line work where the width of the line changes, and it's very crucial, especially for scripts, but also for cartoon images, etc. So we can actually create some dynamics within the line work itself. And so here you see a much thicker part of the line, and it goes thinner here. These kinds of lines can be built up, or they can simply be tattooed with a tapered needle. Now this amount of thickness going into this thin line can probably not be tattooed simply by a tapered needle, but it can easily be built up. And if you look at these areas, it's clear that some line work has been made here on the edges, and then it's been faded or colored in here to make it even thicker. But this is a prime example of dynamic line work, right? Here's another good example. Sorry, the picture is very small, but this was one of the best examples I found. I couldn't find who the artist is. But anyway, let's look at the line width. So we have very thin lines here. And if you look at under the pumpkin here, we have very, very thick lines. And this creates a much more dynamic image when we play with line work like this. So I suggest after you watch this module that you actually go and look at different tattooed or line work tattooed artwork and actually examine it and think about what we spoke here today about line width and dynamic lines. Now there's a place for completely even lines, there's a place for dynamic lines, but just get familiar with it, because after you understand the differences, it will be so much easier for you to actually start incorporating these things into your artwork. Okay, so we covered a little bit the basics of what line work should be, and also introduced the concepts of dynamic lines. So line work is really one of the fundamentals in tattooing, not for all styles, but in most styles it is the structure and the one thing that brings definition to the artwork. So it's a very fundamental technique to master for pretty much every single artist out there. Now some people become very accustomed to just using one specific needle, and that's okay, but I think it will serve you well if you become familiar with more different needle types and how to actually use them. So to create lines, we need a round grouping. This is going to be either round liners or round shaders. Now yes, there are different types of ways of using magnums or flat needles as well to create some kind of flowing lines or calligraphy, but we will not go into that yet, so we're going to stick to what we really call line work. So round liners and round shaders, what's the difference? Round liners are going to be grouped way tighter together compared to round shaders. I will show you a picture of that as well. So here you can see a shader, and you see the shader is more formed like an eye, whereas a liner is more shaped like a V. So it has a much sharper tapering in the grouping of the needles. And therefore we can also create some different line thicknesses depending on the liner that we're using. If we're using a shader, the line thickness is pretty much going to be even throughout the line. And this is not because of the different needle pins, it's because of how the different needle pins are placed. So you see the shader is very even when it comes to the tip, right? A liner, again, as you see in this picture, well, it's not so clear because the needles are so small, but a liner again tapers towards the point of the needle like this, so all the pins are more close together at the end point. Therefore, with liners you can create much more sharp lines compared to shaders, but shaders also chew up skin a little bit less. This is something we already discussed in the Needles 101. So again, if you feel like you need some kind of extra boost in your understanding of needles, I recommend returning to that Needle 101 for now until we go more deep into things. Okay, so perhaps this clarifies a little bit. You see that all these needle pins are actually tapered more towards a point in a liner, like here. Now, there are different sorts of liners also. There are very tight liners and loose liners, which become more like shaders then. But you see here, there is a clear tapering of the needle pins going more towards a point at the end. And here again, if you look at the shader, the needle pins are all straight. So it forms a very big circle at the tip here. The only tapering that's happening here is the specific tapering on the end of each needle pin. But the needle pins themselves are not tapered towards a point at the end of the needle grouping. Now, I would be very interested to hear from you guys. Would you guys need more visual aid and more visual guidance on the different needle types? Like, do you actually need me to start creating professional visuals for this? Or is it quite clear what I'm speaking about? I would really appreciate your feedback on this, because for me, obviously, this is very clear, but some people tend to need more visual aid to understand what we're speaking about. So is this sufficient, or would it be sufficient if I have a whiteboard and I draw, or do you actually need kind of professional animated things in order to understand what we're speaking about here? Your feedback goes a long way, because then I know how to plan. And obviously, if we need professional stuff, it's going to take a lot more time, effort, and also monetary power from me to be able to create that kind of stuff for you. But anyway, the feedback is very much appreciated, because then I know which way we're going to take this course. So some other key points in creating proper line work is you need to maintain steady hand movement. And your hand movement needs to be in accordance with your machine speed. You also need consistent pressure or consistent needle depth. We already spoke about needle depth earlier, and now it's also important to understand that if you have something like a one-liner or a three-liner, it's going to penetrate the skin so easy, so you really don't need a lot of pressure. It's already going to be in the skin. But if you're suddenly starting to use an 18 round shader, you will need a lot more pressure to actually penetrate the right layer of the skin. See, that's why we introduced all the concepts already in the last chapter, so you understand now when we're speaking about the right layer of the skin, and we're talking about pressure and different needle groupings. So the larger the needle grouping, the more pressure we need to actually penetrate through the skin and reach the correct layer and deposit the ink in the correct layer. And if we do that, we don't end up with this kind of stuff like you see here on the left, where clearly we have not reached the right layer of depth, or we have moved too fast. If you happen to have a weak machine, you will have big issues whenever you move into larger groupings of needles, whether it be round shaders or magnums or even large round liners. Now keep in mind regarding the needles as well, if you're using round liners, they're more tightly grouped, which means you're going to have more poke holes in a smaller area, and this also leads to more damage, but it also leads to a faster saturation. So keep in mind this relationship as you choose your needles. Also, round liners tend to have a much sharper edge at the line, whereas round shaders tend to leave a little bit of a softer edge on the line work itself. The needle angle that you penetrate the skin is of great importance, because if we go perpendicular to the line work we're trying to create, we can cause a lot of blowouts. Now, a blowout means when the pigment spreads, and usually the pigment will spread towards the side that your needle is leaning towards. So focus on, if you need to angle your needle, then angle it along the line, not across the line. And in general, before we go into more depth, a needle angle between 45 degrees and 90 degrees is perfectly fine. I don't think that's something we need to be focusing on right now, other than if you choose to have an angle on the needle in comparison to the skin other than 90 degrees, then do not lean across the line work, because then we again cause the chance of blowout. Stretching is a very big part of tattooing, and especially for line work. Now, if you're tattooing a very tight skin area like the outer calf or inner forearm, then stretching is still crucial, but it's not as crucial. When you start tattooing areas such as the ribs or inner upper arm, something like that, and you need to create proper clean artwork, then stretching is so crucial. Because what happens is, if we don't stretch the skin and we have some loose skin that we're dealing with, your needle depth will not be consistent. Also, the deposition of ink will not be consistent. It's going to be also like kind of like a drum that you would be tapping, but the membrane on top of the drum would be loose. So what will happen, especially if we have larger groupings, it's just going to push the skin down, but the needle is not actually going to penetrate. But once we tighten the skin, the needle goes through much easier. And this is a habit that is hard to learn in the beginning, because your fingers are going to get tired. You have maybe too much ointment on your fingers and the skin's slippery and all this stuff. I will introduce a lot of ways to learn to really stretch the skin. But for those who have some issues with that, just start paying attention and start being intentional about really stretching the skin, because your tattooing is going to get so much easier when you really have stretched skin. Now, many things that can also help with this is how to position the client for difficult areas, because if we can position our client in a way that the skin is already stretched as much as possible, we do ourselves a big favor, because it leaves less stretching for us with our hand. Okay, again, I could talk about all of these topics for so long, so I need to keep it a little bit on the shorter side. So this is still 101s. And I'm sure at some stage we get into actual visuals where I tattoo and I teach and I speak about each thing, and maybe we need to break it down into smaller areas, but first we need to cover the ground on each of these things so that we can then go into more detail. Round liners, therefore crisp lines, and with those we already have the needle grouping tapering, so we can change the line weight by just choosing how deep we go. Round shader needles, those are perfect for thicker uniform lines. They chew up less skin and they still saturate very well. And remember to adjust your machine speed according to your hand movement. As I already spoke about voltage in the last chapter, in the very beginning chapter of tattoo techniques, do not blindly listen on other artists what kind of voltage they use, because it is machine dependent and it is also dependent on your hand speed. So you need to find what works best for you. You can take some slight advice from machine builders, etc., but do not become blindly a follower of what voltage other people use. If you want to use anything larger than 5 liners, then I really recommend you to buy a strong machine that's working very evenly and consistently. Do not opt for the cheapest options usually. You can find something cheap, something very good, but the tendency is that the more pricey the machine, the better it is. But this is not always true either. But just make sure that the machine is strong enough. If you're uncertain, you can always reach out to the machine builder and ask what kind of groupings the machine easily pushes, and if it gets weaker with larger groupings. For line work also, I would recommend a punchy machine, so something with a larger stroke, at least 3.4 up. Now, as depending on the machine build, some machines with larger stroke can cause for a little bit extra vibration. So if you're dealing with very, very fine lines, then you may opt for a slightly smaller stroke length. This can help also because the amount of ink deposited then is not as great as with a larger stroke. Because this is again something we already talked about, so I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, but these are important things. So if you have a very small stroke length, your needle will probably not go all the way into the tip to gather more ink. Therefore your needle will carry a little bit less ink on it and you need to renew ink more often. Diamond tip is something that I want to introduce to people doing line work because I think it is a huge benefit. Although they do not exist as much as they used to exist. So I recommend if you find a needle brand that uses this kind of tip, or if you're using conventional needles, then you can choose tips easily for yourself. But if you're using cartridges, then if you can find needle brands that still create diamond tips, I really recommend using them because this will hold the needle in place. I will show you some pictures of this so you understand what I mean. But first I'm going to speak about it a little bit. So the traditional tip used for liners is like a round tip where the needle just hangs in between here and it can move a little bit from side to side, right? So a diamond tip has more of a V at the bottom. So when you pull a line, the needle is going to sit very straight in the middle. It can't move to the left or to the right. So we have a much more stable needle. So for anybody, especially fine line stuff, I really recommend looking for diamond tips for yourself. And if you find a good brand, you can of course share it here in the community. There's no harm in that. I think many people will be actually very great. I think many people will actually be very grateful for that. So I'm going to show you now a picture so I'm now going to show you a picture so you understand what a diamond tip is. Okay, so even better, I have a video here. So you see this tip, okay, so you see this tip, this is clearly a diamond tip. You see the V here at the bottom. And this holds the needle very tightly in place here at the bottom. So as you see, as it's moving, and especially if we're pushing lines, the needle is going to keep at the very bottom of this V shape. So this ensures a very, very stable needle movement. And here's an example of a round tip. And I also want to show that A round tip that's too tight can cause for the needle movement not to be consistent, especially with weaker machines. And you'll even see it here on the video. So you see how the needle movement is not actually fully stable. So the tip needs to have enough room on all sides, and also this obviously allows for more ink flow if the tip has more room on each side of the needle. And here's an example of a round tip that is too large, and you will see the needle actually moving within this tip. From side to side it's possible. So a diamond tip ensures that our needle actually stays fully in place at all times. I also want to show you a trick, although this should be done only with sterile equipment and only clean equipment. So nowadays anyway you can find needle tips with great visibility, but here's an example of a perfectly circular needle tip like you see here, and we can just make a little V cut in it so that we can actually see the needle from the upper part, just to get a slightly better visibility on it. Now you should not use something like I use here, especially unless it's very clean. But this way you see that the tip now actually allows for much better visibility of the needle hitting the skin. The good thing is that most brands already offer these kinds of tips now with cartridges as well. Here's already an example of an open tip where you actually see how the needle hits. So here you're also gonna see a normal circular tip, and if you have a very small 3 liner, any kind of small movement here inside the tip, if we don't have a V shape, it's gonna be clearly visible. So that V shape or diamond tip will really help you in creating much more straight line work, because there's very little to no vibration of the needle within the tip. And a few words about stretching. So as you see here, we're stretching along the line, and this way we can actually allow for much more clean line work. If we're stretching across the line, like perpendicular to the line, then this can really cause wobbly lines as we stretch the skin more between the 2 fingers compared to the other areas of the line work. So it can cause uneven lines, but it can also cause very wobbly lines. And here's an example of what kind of angle you should avoid using. Here the stretch is correct, but the angle of the needle is wrong, and we face a very huge risk of causing a blowout on this side of the line. And you understand, because the area we deposit ink in is not the upper area of the skin, it's going to be slightly lower here, so we're actually depositing ink somewhere over here with this angle, and in time it's definitely going to bleed out and look like the line is way thicker on this side of the line. So those were some basics that you need in order to create good line work. There's a lot more, and we will go into that in due time. I also feel we should not be putting in too much information at once, because then part of the information will be lost. So one step at a time, and we create a very solid foundation for you guys, and not to cramp up your mind with too much stuff at once. So I want to also introduce a few practical exercises. And one of the best ways, I think, to learn line work without actually tattooing, as this is something that you can practice all day, every day on your own, is using a marker. What you can do is you can prepare first some line work or some stencil with very thin lines. They can be straight, they can be curved, etc., whatever you want. But something that is complex and actually challenges you. And then try to follow along these drawings with a marker. Because what happens with a marker is if you angle it wrong, it's gonna bleed out, just in the same way as a tattoo needle will cause in the skin. If you stop with the marker for too long or move too slowly, it's gonna cause for an increased amount of pigment in that area of the paper, and then it's gonna bleed out in a similar way to a tattoo needle. So what you need is you need a correct angle of the marker, and you need constant hand speed. So this is a very good teacher in teaching you the correct motoric movements you need in order to achieve good lines on skin as well. So if you have any issues in creating line work, or if you feel like your hand is shaking or you're unsure, then go through a lot of these exercises and create more challenging lines for yourself, and this will create much more confidence when you're hitting skin as well. So remember that clear, sharp outlines, they're essential for pretty much most of the tattoo designs out there, most of the styles out there. And issues in line work is gonna be so clearly visible. I actually would argue that it's easier to fuck up in color realism or black and gray, and people will not notice it compared to line work. Line work for me is one of the most difficult things to pull off, because every single mistake will be so clearly visible that we have no room for error at all. So as said, the mistakes are immediately noticeable and very hard to correct as well. So what you need is nerves of steel and confidence, and that's where the marker exercises also come in handy, because they create at least a good confidence in your motoric skills, which will translate to skin as well. But after that, what you need is repetition, repetition, repetition. And whenever you get this repetition, be intentional about what you're doing. Because if you're mindlessly just pulling lines here and there, then you're not going to be learning so much. But if you can learn from every single time you make any line, you will become so much better, so much faster. So be intentional about it. Be intentional and conscious, and remember, practice makes perfect. And I know many of you are waiting to get into the deep end of the pool where I teach exactly the techniques I'm using. But truth of the matter is, I'm also using the very basics. And if I wouldn't know how to do the basics, I would not be able to create pretty much anything. So we need to learn to walk before we run. And I'm sure even if you knew everything that we spoke about here, which I doubt that everybody did, but even if you knew everything, it's still a good reminder, you know? So, because we often tend to forget some of the basics, whether we forget how to stretch the skin or stuff, we become so easily slaves of our own way of doing things that we forget to actually be intentional about what we are doing. So thank you everybody, and as always, I again appreciate a lot to get some feedback below the video. I know it takes some of your time to get that feedback because you actually have to write something, but keep in mind that I'm here doing all these videos and taking time off to create content for you. So if you find it in your heart to give some feedback or thoughts on what you want to learn about line work, then it's going to help me in the future to be able to create the best possible content for you as well. So again, thanks everybody. Bye.